Good morning. Ribhu Gita, the Song of Ribhu, chapter 35, the Samadhi of abidance in the self by the knowledge of the certitude of non-duality. Verse number 1. Nidaga, as expounded earlier by the Lord of all the world, Ishvara, I shall tell you here about the steadfast abidance in the undivided self, in the contemplation that there is not a trace of in the contemplation that there is not a trace of the appearance of this world apart from the universal substratum, the supreme Brahman, and all is Brahman, not different from the self, which is existence, consciousness, bliss. 2. When inquired into, all the names and forms that appear as differences in Brahman, of the nature of the one undivided essence, not different from the incorporeal existence, the self, are not different at all. So all the names and forms that appear as differences in Brahman, of the nature of the one undivided essence, not different from the incorporeal existence, the self, are not different at all. Cast aside everything with the blemishless certitude that all is the peaceful Brahman, and I am that changeless peaceful Brahman. Abide in your natural self. 3. The intellect and other appearances have not the least existence apart from Brahman, which is only consciousness. The mind and other appearances have not the least existence apart from Brahman, the perfectly full. Casting aside everything with the non-dual certitude that any kind of appearance is Brahman, and that the one perfect fullness is who I am, abide changelessly in the self. Verse number 4. There is nothing as darkness or light, or something different, this or that, you or me, bewilderment or clear perception or illusion, mind or its ramifications, form or formlessness. Casting aside everything with the blessed certitude that all that exists is Brahman, and that am I, changelessly abide in the self. 5. There never is any such delusion as this is the Lord, Ishvara, and this is the world, which is his creation, and I am a jiva, an individual being, and I am born here. I am tied by bondage. I suffer. I am a boy, the old man. I am a mortal. Casting aside everything with the blemishless certitude that all that exists is the differenceless Brahman, and that I am, abide changelessly as the self. 6. None of the illusions such as Shiva, Hari, or Brahma, creation, sustenance, and destruction, tapas, austerity or intense spiritual practice, japa, repetition of a mantra, or sacred shrines, charity, a deity, or service exist, casting aside everything with the unhindered certitude that all is the taintless Brahman, and that am I, abide changelessly in the self. 7. There do not exist any of these illusions such as what is laid down in so many ways by the Vedas, what is laid down at length by the treatises, what factors are recognized by religion, that delusion and such exist, and that delusion and such exist not. Casting aside everything by the steadfast certitude that the Supreme Brahman is the One, and that am I, abide changelessly in the Self. 8. They are all false, all the illusions bandied about, such as non existence, existence, duality, the One, the Many, and the All, the troublesome, the new, the nearby, the far off, sorrow, happiness, and such, casting aside everything by the unencumbered certitude that all this is Brahman, the mass of bliss, and that am I, abide changelessly in the self. 9. All the delusions of the mind, wakefulness, dream, deep sleep, the fourth state, the subtle and other bodies and their experiences, various groupings as the aggregate and the discrete, are totally untrue. Casting aside everything by the faultless, steadfast certitude that all is the great Brahman, and that am I, abide changelessly in the self. Ten. There are none of the delusions of the mind, such as the extensive variety of sins and duties, the plethora of prescriptions and proscriptions, the worship with attributes, devotion, the knowledge of attributes, the real and the unreal, casting aside everything with your inner steadfastness in the certitude that all is the divisionless Brahman, and that am I, abide changelessly in the self. 11. There are none of the specious notions of various kinds, such as meditation on the qualityless nature, and knowledge of the attributeless form, and the bondage arising out of duality, and the liberation being the one, casting aside everything with the rare, steadfast certitude that all is the motionless Brahman, and that am I, abide changelessly in the self. 12. There are none of the delusions of duality, such as the inquiry into the existent and non-existent, the inquiry into the mobile and immobile, the inquiry into consciousness and non-consciousness, and the inquiry into the little and the great, casting aside everything with the non-dual certitude that all is the one supreme Brahman, and that am I, abide changelessly in the self. 13. There's nothing as the misapprehensions of the thinking mind, like the inquiry into attributes and the absence of attributes, the inquiry into the self and the non-self, the inquiry into the non-dual, and the inquiry into pleasure and pain. Casting aside everything with the certitude that Brahman, without a second, is all, and that am I, abide changelessly in the self. 14. Casting aside even the conviction that the I adopts, that all the world is completely non-existent, and only the motionless supreme is existence, that all is totally non-existent, and only the self is perpetual existence, that the self indeed is Brahman, and Brahman without a second is the self, abide changelessly in the self. 15. Casting afar all kinds of mantras, casting afar the great casting afar the great Panchashara, the mantra of the 5 letters of Nama Shivaya, casting after the shining Ashtakshara, the mantra of 8 letters, mm. Casting afar all the sages who teach these, casting afar all transient talk, casting afar inactive silence too, casting afar all the misapprehensions of the wandering mind, abide changelessly in the self. 16. Casting afar the essential with the non-essential, casting afar the good with the bad, casting afar the heroic with the non-heroic, casting afar the triad of qualities with the sextet of qualities, casting afar all cause and result, casting afar all that is illusory appearance, casting afar all veiling and such, abide changelessly in the self. 17. Casting afar all thoughts of things that are achieved, casting afar all thoughts of things that are not achieved, casting afar all thoughts of things that are sought, casting afar all thoughts of things that are not sought, casting afar the thought of the Supreme which is accoladed, casting afar all the thoughts of the here and now in all its parts, casting afar all the thoughts of the wavering mind, abide changelessly in the self. 18. Casting aside desire and anger and all, casting aside hauteur and ostentatiousness and all, casting aside all the multitude of delusion, casting aside duality and non-duality and all, casting aside name and form, casting aside thoughts of we and they and all and such, casting aside all things that are considered apart from ourselves, abide changelessly in the self, negating all variety of conditionings such as the infatuated mind, the intellect, the ego, inner faculties, life, body, organs, senses, eyes, illusion, the difference-ridden individual being, the jiva, the supreme and the world, further casting aside all the mental projections arising therefrom, and understanding well the identity of the natural oneness of the word that with the word I, abide changelessly in the self. 20. Realizing with certitude that whatever is seen as a superimposition on the self is not apart from the self, that the self is that which is the undivided Supreme Brahman, and it is the undivided Supreme Brahman that is the self, that it is Brahman, not different from the self that I am, and casting aside all that is apart from the self, abide changelessly in the self. 21. Sage of great, intense practice, casting aside all ideas of difference, by the differenceless knowledge of the Supreme, the knowledge that all the appearances of superimposition arise in me, who am eternal knowledge, and are therefore indeed all I, the perfectly full knowledge, and that I, the expanse of knowledge, am Brahman, abide changelessly in the self. 22. Like the truth of the mirage seen superimposed on a stretch of hot earth, being ultimately only the stretch of earth, whatever is seen as a superimposition on me, the substratum, is only myself, and differenceless I am Brahman. Casting aside all ideas of difference, by such differenceless knowledge of the Supreme, abide changelessly in the Self. 23. Like the truth that all that is seen in me, in a dream, is nothing apart from me, all that is seen in me during waking state is never apart from me. Casting aside all ideas of difference, by the differenceless knowledge that I, with nothing apart, am Brahman, and by the differenceless knowledge of the Supreme with nothing apart, abide changelessly in the Self. 24. If the world and such really exist, they should be changelessly present in deep sleep. As all these do not exist in deep sleep, all these are dream stuff, illusion. I, who remain unchanged, am Brahman, casting aside all ideas of difference by the pure differenceless knowledge of the Supreme, abide changelessly in the Self. 25. The world, the individuals, and the Supreme, not a trace of which existed before the projections of the mind arose, and not a trace of which will exist after those projections of the mind subside, and which seem to have a gross existence, though appearing in between due to the projections of the mind, when thoroughly inquired into, are realized to not existent at all, thus negate all else and abide changeless in the Self. There is 26. There is no mind and no thought of the world or individuals or others in deep sleep. In dream, there is the mind and extensive thoughts of the world and others. By this comparison and contrast, upon even a little inquiry, there is not even a trace of this world and individuals and others, which are all merely of the inner faculties, thus negating all such thoughts, abide changelessly in the Self. 27. There is no mind, no distortion of the mind, no delusion that the mind is the cause, no waking state, no dream, no deep sleep, no name, no form, no me, no you, nothing else ever, never anything at all, negating all differences by inquiry, and abiding as the nature of the undivided Absolute, with nothing separate, abide changelessly in the Self. 28. Like the evident truth that the serpent and other superimpositions, when inquired into, are nothing in the least different from the natural substratum of the rope, there is nothing of illusory superimposition except the pure substratum itself, which is myself. By the process of such negation and blemishless discernment, be established as the nature of the great undivided Supreme, and abide changelessly in the Self. 29. Just as the conditioning of the pot and the pitcher are removed, the pot space and the pitcher space are one. If the conditioning of ignorance and such be removed, the pure individual being and the Supreme are one. Realizing by the certitude of discernment the innate identity of the Supreme and the individual, without any sense of duality, and becoming thereby of the nature of the dense, undivided infinite, abide changelessly in the self. 30. If, after inquiry, the inapplicable meanings of the words are removed from the sentence, He, I am, the meaning to be understood is the innate identity. Likewise, in the sentence, Tattvam asi, that you are, the meaning to be understood after removal of the inapplicable meaning of the words is the innate identity. Understanding this, relinquish all the mental differences and abide changelessly in the self. 31. Negating all the illusory conditionings of the individual and the Supreme by blemishless inquiry, and attaining the knowledge of the fearless, undivided meaning that the nature of Brahman, indicated by the word that, is indeed I, denoted by the word you, and being rid of all the hard-to-remove bondage of worldly existence, abide changelessly in the self. 32. There's not the least of the differences, such as the world, the Supreme, you and I. I'm not in any way different from Brahman. Brahman is nothing different from me. All that has been spoken of is the undivided Supreme Brahman, and I am that perfectly full Brahman. Casting aside everything by such undivided knowledge of the Supreme, ever abide in the Self. 33. I indeed am Brahman, the mass of existence, consciousness, bliss. I indeed am Brahman, transcending the real and the unreal. I indeed am Brahman, the eternal and the partless. I indeed am Brahman, which permeates without interstices. I indeed am Brahman, the pure knowledge. I indeed am Brahman, the self-illumined. Casting aside everything by such non-dual knowledge, ever abide in the self. 34. I indeed am Brahman, without a perishable body. I indeed am Brahman, without manifold states. I indeed am Brahman, without anything separate, such as Vishwan, the totality of individuals in the waking state, and others. I indeed am Brahman, without anything integral, such as Virat, cosmic experiencer functioning through all bodies in the waking state, and others. I indeed am Brahman, without the Pashu, undivided souls. I indeed am Brahman, without the Pashu, individual souls, the Pati, the Lord, and the Pasa, bondage. I indeed am Brahman, without anything of the high or low, casting aside everything with the sorrowless knowledge, ever abide in the self. 35. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, devoid of attachment. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, transcending the fourth state. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which is ever motionless. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which is the most peaceful of the peaceful. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which has no bondage and liberation. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which is the expanse of consciousness. Casting aside everything by such limitless knowledge, ever abide in the self. 36. I indeed am the eternal Supreme Brahman, which is the indestructible. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which never gets dislodged. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which is untouched by any blemish. I indeed am the great Supreme Brahman, which is knowledge. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which is bondageless and liberated. I indeed am the Supreme Brahman, which has no delimitations. Casting aside everything by pure knowledge, ever abide in the self. 37. The dualistic mode of I am the body and such, the witness mode that I am the witness of everything, the undivided mode that I am the one absolute, rejecting two of these three modes and attaining the differenceless knowledge of the Supreme Brahman by the divisionless undivided Supreme mode, and being rid of all the original bondage of the misery of worldly existence, ever abide in the self. 38. Setting aside all yoga, such as of ingoing and outgoing breaths, setting aside all action and contemplation, setting aside all essenceless religions, and being of the conviction, the bhava, that Brahman is the reality, attaining thereby the complete realization of the Supreme Brahman, and being rid of all the false bondage of the world, and being established as the undivided Absolute, revered one, ever abide in the self. 39. The gross body and others are all of the nature of Brahman. Whatever is seen as jewel is of the nature of Brahman. Space and time are all of the nature of Brahman. Whatever things that are seen are all of the nature of Brahman. I am the root cause, the Supreme Brahman. Setting aside everything by such settled knowledge, abide as the true undivided self, the true abode, which is not different from the Supreme Brahman. 40. Attaining undivided realization by the conviction, the bhava, that all the appearances, such as the individuals, jivas, and the Supreme, are only the Supreme Brahman, which is consciousness alone. And I indeed am that pure Brahman, and I indeed am that partless Brahman, and I indeed am that undivided Brahman, and casting aside all ideas of difference, and remaining desireless, abide as the undivided self alone, not different from the Supreme Brahman. 41. All is the Supreme Brahman. There's no doubt about this. I indeed am that. There's not an atom of doubt of this. I say this in the name of the Supreme Lord, Ishvara, the Lord of all the world. What is said is the truth. There's no doubt about this. Worthy son, therefore, being aware with great certitude that all is ever that Brahman alone, and I am that, and thereby casting aside everything, abide as the pure self alone. 42. All appearances that seem sentient are but the Supreme Shiva, which is consciousness alone. I am indeed Shiva, which has nothing in the least to learn. I am indeed that Shiva, which has nothing apart. By attaining the undivided realization through such practicable bhava, conviction, and being rid of the bondage of the birth and death cycle, abide as yourself alone, not different from the Supreme Brahman. 43. Thus have I described the abidance in the undivided self, as expounded by our Lord. Son, if this is heard just once or read without blemish as now told, the undecaying state of liberation will result. Is there any doubt that those who hear this or read this every day will attain the bondageless supreme liberation? 44. Only those who deeply inquire into and contemplate upon the nature of the perfectly full, undivided Supreme Shiva, as the substratum of all the numerous names and forms of things, shall attain taintless, undivided abidance in the Self, and cross the hard-to-cross ocean of transmigration. None else can ever cross the ocean by any other action which is tainted. Hence, 45. All seekers after liberation should cross this troublesome ocean of transmigration by the grace of our Lord, after thoroughly inquiring into the undifferentiated Supreme Shiva, of the nature of the single undivided essence, and that which is not different from the Self, and by changeless abidance in the undivided Self, with the constantly practiced bhava, conviction, that I am this Self, I am Shiva, I am Brahman. 46. The sage Ribhu enlightened Nidaga about abidance in the undivided Self, as earlier expounded by the Lord of all the world, the Supreme Lord Ishvara. Thus did the omniscient Skanda convey this great truth to that meritorious sage Jagishvara, and thus did Sutta, who was well versed in all things, graciously address the assembled sages. 47. It is the infinite form of our perfectly full Lord in a state of joyous dance that proclaims the abidance in the Self. There is nothing except the one perfectly full reality. All misapprehension is eliminated by the strength of the knowledge of the identity that I am that undecaying reality. It's the last verse. I'll read it one more time. It is the infinite form of our perfectly full Lord in a state of joyous dance that proclaims the abidance in the Self. There is nothing except the one perfectly full reality. All misapprehension is eliminated by the strength of the knowledge of the identity that I am that undecaying reality. And with that ends chapter 35, the Ribhu Gita. Have a really good day. Bye bye.